German Expressionism is a broad term that applies to a series of individual art movements that took place in Germany and around it in the first half of the 20th century. What we're talking about basically is a period of upheaval in German history. We're talking about World War One, we're talking about World War Two, and there is an intense period of poverty and depression. We're talking economic depression between the First World War and the Second World War as well. So it's a period of social and political upheaval, and angst is the common word that might be applied, a German word that implies pain and suffering. This shows up in a style that is generally tagged Expressionism. Expressionism means basically an art form that has been abstracted to convey ideas or feelings or emotions. How does the artist do this? By distorting line, shape, or color. The purpose of German Expressionism is often to convey a social or a political message, but at the very least to reflect the tension of the years of war and also the pre war years that take place in Germany. These artists are going to look at precursors, particularly the post impressionists, folks like Gauguin and Van Gogh, who used color for purposes of expression, going outside of the lines of naturalistic use of color. So, for example, Gauguin could paint grass that's red by using color in an emotionally charged way. The German expressionists will return to take a scant at look at the post impressionist works. In addition to that, though, Munch is incredibly important to the German expressionists, and Munch, in fact, is going to exhibit in Germany. Drawing a little bit from the post impressionists also will be the Fauves and their love of amazing color and intense color, used specifically to convey emotion. All of these are going to be sources that are going to be very, very important for the German expressionists in the first 50 years of the 20th century. This is, I think, a pretty good comparison, which will give us an idea of how artists changed as it entered the modern world. We're going to take a look at Emil Nolde's Last Supper, which is located on the left of the screen, and make a quick comparison with I'm going to say, all-time most famous Last Supper, and that would be Italian High Renaissance by Leonardo da Vinci. A word about Nolde first. He is a German expressionist. He worked largely on his own, but he reflects the basic elements of German expressionism. By working on his own, I mean not being attached to one of the groups like the Bridge or the Blue Rider. He was born of a peasant family and developed an incredible love of the land. He begins as a wood carver, so he has, I'm going to say, a sense of the tactile, of the sense of touch in terms of painting and, as we'll see, printmaking. He loved Germany. He loved the land, so much so that he actually changed his name to the name of his village. His original name was Emil Hansen. His village was Nolde. He became Emil Nolde. He had such strong nationalistic ideas. In fact, he really wanted to help Germany come back, make Germany great again, reinvigorate Germany, and this will ultimately lead him to join the Nazi Party, which, as we'll talk about in a moment, does not turn out so well for him. For right now, let's focus on his interpretation of the Last Supper when Jesus is having his last meal with his disciples. These disciples in the painting by Nolde, let's take a closer look at that. These are simple German peasants. They could easily come from Nolde's own village. There's a sense of the primitive, the direct, the down to earth, maybe even a kind of a crude quality associated with the figures. The paint has been laid on the surface very roughly. It's unmixed. So he's putting one color next to another, forcing the viewer to mix the color optically, which intensifies the color as it's conveyed to the viewer. So it has a very rough, bumpy, we could say, quote unquote, an unrefined or perhaps an unacademic surface. The space in this is also compressed, and the figures are pushed to the foreground. next to the surface of the picture plane. This is one of the highlights of modernism, getting rid of the window effect that is such an important part of the Italian High Renaissance. These colors also, reds and yellows, they seem acidic, they seem to clash, and they seem to enhance the emotions. The faces of the figures, and that includes Jesus, are kind of mask-like and probably attest to some of the growing influence looking at non Western works of art, putting all of this into a sacred context, which has been treated in a very, very, I'm going to say, serious and formal way. Comparing Nolde's work to Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, you can see that Leonardo's literally does appear to be a window moving into the distance along very carefully designated perspective lines. Whoops, sorry about that. Leading the viewer in space and leading the viewer, in fact, down to the head of Jesus. These are tapestries along the wall. They form perspective lines that also lead us directly to the figure of Jesus. This image also creates figures that are monumental, grand, heroic, and ideal. They're very far from the ordinary peasant types that Nolde is incorporating. Modern art tends to turn to an audience of middle class, or in Nolde's case, of peasant class individuals with whom we can identify. Leonardo's paint surface also would have been relatively smooth. Nolde's is rough and bumpy, and Nolde also distorts his figures. If you look at the hands of Jesus as he grasps the chalice, I think you can see that they are distorted in order to intensify the emotion and the idea of the significance, the symbolic significance of the chalice, which will be used later in Christians' celebrations to reenact the sacrifice of Jesus and Jesus's blood. These two paintings then are incredibly different. Each is significant in its own time. Nolde's is very modern in the power intensity and the compression of space. Here's just a closer look at those hands, the chalice, and the faces of the figures, which do appear simplified and mask-like. Even the face of Jesus with very broad planes, but very, very different in treatment compared to works from the High Renaissance or from the academic schools. Nolde is also a very important printmaker, and this is one of the contributions that the German expressionists give to us, leave to us. It's kind of a revitalization of printmaking. I think the reason that Nolde was drawn to prints is that Germany had a very, very rich past in printmaking, so he saw it as a nationalistic expression, an expression of pride in the contributions of Germany. So I have on the screen on the right the Head of a Prophet by Nolde. On the left, I have the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, which was created in the German High Renaissance by an artist whose name is Albert Dürer, which is, I'm going to say, a pretty famous work of wood cutting. Both of these are made from blocks of wood where the image has been created by cutting away the white areas. The surface of the wood is inked and transferred to a sheet of paper. There's a huge difference in the approach that Nolde is using, though. He is gouging out and using very rough lines, jagged lines, splintered areas of wood, and gouged areas. He is quite literally letting the wood talk and become an expressive element of the creation of this composition. The mood of Nolde's prophet, I think, would qualify as that German word angst, conveying a kind of inner suffering or a kind of anguish. The black ink that derives from the gouged wood almost resembles drops of blood, as if to convey a kind of unspecified pain and emotion that really tends to be characteristic of German expressionism. This treatment of the prophet might also remind you of Rouault's Old King, and perhaps now make it clear why it would be so easy to stick Rouault in with the German expressionists. This is figure 6.7 in our textbook, and it's a female dancer by Nolde. It's a color litho, which is another type of print. In other words, we can get multiple copies from a single original. In the case of a litho, it's created with ink washes painted onto a stone. What Nolde is doing in this image is suggesting the kind of frenzied emotion of a quote unquote tribal dance. In the period of the first half of the 20th century, there was an incredible interest in non Western works of art. Nolde is even going to go on a trip to New Guinea and to the Far East to encounter face to face non Western cultures. Okay, what's the attraction? Well, after the opening of the Western art world to Oriental popular prints from Japan, artists looked around for other sources of inspiration because they believed that non Western cultures produced purer, more direct emotions that could be put into, well, treated as inspiration for works of art. In other words, non Western cultures, the West believed, were more in touch with their own emotions, less, I'm going to say, ruined or controlled by the cultural world of the West and the formal qualities that arose as a result of the Industrial Revolution. So our artists are seeking direct encounters with non Western art and culture in order to return to a kind of natural, more say primitive, and primitive not used in a negative way, but to suggest living in harmony with each other, with nature, and with our own emotions. And that's the point of this particular image that Nolde has crafted. Nolde was actually a member of the Nazi Party. He supported Hitler, certainly initially believing that Hitler, and as many German citizens did, believing that Hitler could bring Germany back to a position of power and strength. However, along with the rise of the Nazi Party, there was control of artworks. And in particular, Hitler had a very strong interest in art because he had begun his career attempting to become an artist himself. In order to have your works of art shown in Nazi Germany, they had to be ideal in content and they had to be crafted in, I'm going to say, an academic manner. In other words, they had to be lifelike and naturalistic, none of this modern stuff with abstraction and with rough brushwork on the surface. In other words, by the time we get to 1936, the Nazi Party under Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda for Germany, is no longer going to allow Nolde to paint. It's going to be considered his work as too crude, too un-German. So he's actually going to be forbidden to create works and show these works in public. He can't sell them, he can't teach, he can't do anything with his art. The Nazis, in fact, are going to confiscate works of art that they think are inappropriate, and that's going to be in all media. And they're going to put together a huge art show. What you're looking at are photographs from this art show on degenerate art, in which the Nazis display works of art that are considered to be bad, un-German, unrefined. Uh, of the works that were confiscated, 1,000 of those were Nolde's, and they were considered all to be bad, bad, literally bad, as in evil, degenerate, and un-Germanic in nature. Now, many of these confiscated works were actually destroyed. Others, if they had value, sometimes the Nazis sold them. But all of the confiscation impacted the artists who were working in Germany at this time, causing many artists actually to flee, to get out because they knew they couldn't continue working there. And it wasn't just that they couldn't continue, they had to also fear for their own safety if they continued the practice of trying to make works of art while remaining in Germany. This is just an example of some of the pieces that Nolde did create in secret. These are what he called his unpainted pictures. These are the pictures that he painted while he wasn't allowed to paint. So they're very small in scale. They're very lyrical. They're very emotional. They're, I'm going to say, more actually calmer and more pleasant than the paintings that he was making. For example, I'm thinking of the kind of really lovely, glorious flowers crafted with watercolor, floating in colors into the areas of the paper on which he was painting. So I guess at the end, I could say that Nolde found his own way, even in a period of persecution under the Nazis.